Hello, good day to me, Andy, and this is Andy Wright Travel Thailand News. I often get asked, because I'm very much into investigating this scamdemic, that's what I call it, because it is actually now gone past the point of being, anything significant. We had that last year. Now it's just being silly. 3 lockdowns in the UK with 29 peer-reviewed studies that prove lockdowns do not work. Plenty of other studies from professionals and qualified people who all say that the preventative measures that are in place at the moment are not working because they will not work. And scientifically speaking, it's not going to make any difference. And of course, this is a worldwide problem. It's not just a UK problem. It seems to be that every country is following the same path. But one question that I do get asked, or I get told, rather, they often come out with, we're talking about numbers of people dying in the UK, a bit like this. I'm from the, you know what. And of course, they often come back at you with, oh, but look at Thailand. They only had, whatever, 60, I think it was about 60 deaths in total. What did they do? Oh, they wore masks. Oh, well, there you go. That solves everything, doesn't it? When quite clearly there are many other reasons for it. And of course, trying to explain to these people that it's like banging your head against a brick wall. So often cases I look around for various other professionals to tell you about it. So here's one. Here's a guy called IVOR CUMMINS. He very clearly tells you the reason why Asiana, that's including Thailand, Taiwan, Japan, blah, 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 all of those countries around there, which are categorized as Asiana, he explains why their numbers were less than ours in Europe, and he makes a very good job of it. So rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, here is the video from IVOR CUMMINS.
Hey everyone, there's been a lot of resurgence in Ireland over the past few days of talk of zero COVID Ireland. We need a zero COVID strategy. Look at that, January 28th. And our de facto Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, in fairness, has been pointing out some of the absurdities of that. So fair play to him, I guess. So zero COVID correlational capers, let's get in there. And the whole concept or conceit is based on New Zealand, that we should copy New Zealand, maybe Australia. Let me show you what that really means. So first we need to remind you, WHO official October 2019 guidelines. They did not recommend quarantine of exposed individuals to reduce transmission once a virus was in a region. Significantly, not recommended, and certainly not lock down everyone. And to give an example, we've got around 29 papers now, though there are more, which have analysed the actual empirical evidence of lockdown versus deaths per million across nearly every country. And the outcome of these 30 independent analyses is that the lockdown offers very little to almost nothing, and we know that the lockdown has enormous costs and enormous impact on every facet of society. So the cost benefit is atrocious, but we'll note that the lockdown delivers very little in mortality. Here's an early paper from around May, and it shows a shotgun plot. Stringency in countries versus deaths per million, just a shotgun blast, no pattern. And this one in the Lancet was very clear. Rapid border closures, full lockdowns, etc., were not associated with COVID-19 mortality per million people. So there you go. Very good one here I'll pull out as well. And there were lots of things associated with mortality, like prior season severity and life expectancy, slowdown in countries, metabolic and NCD burden, all these things, and even ultraviolet index. But stringency of the measures to fight pandemia, including lockdown, did not appear to be linked with the death rate. So again, nearly 30 studies, we know the lockdown has minimal real-world impact on mortality. And the last one here I'll have to show you is a recent one from Denmark, and they had an actual kind of natural experiment. They ultra-hard locked down 7 municipalities while not locking down and leaving very, very loose another 4 in the region. And they noted that the rise in the virus matched in both sets, went through the top of the curve, curled over and came down, matched between the 7 hard lockdown and the 4 not locked down at all. So they just noted that their actual experiment of sorts agreed with all of the papers that I referred to a moment ago. So there you go. Now we look at the world, and we look at New Zealand and Australia particularly. But first we look at this massive region here with billions of people. And then we look at this large region here with huge numbers of people. Oceania is the region with Australia, New Zealand and Indonesia. So it's kind of a sub-region of sorts. And we'll note that there's around 30 deaths per million, which is extremely low actually, in this broad oval region here. And there's around 20 deaths per million in Oceania, in this region. Right? So this is an ultra-low region of mortality, relatively speaking, in an epidemic. And remember, Japan's in here too. We're going to touch on that in a moment. What about over here? Around 900 deaths per million. So for anyone enumerate, that's around 30 times more impact, or it's effectively the difference between zero impact and very large impact. Right? And for percentage, it's nearly 3,000% higher here. Okay? So anyone who suggests, given that this region is locking down and masking mandatory more than these guys, anyone who suggests that the difference between these two huge regions is related to lockdown and masks, given what we know from the science, I'd have to say they're stupid, or there's some other reason. Because a 30 times difference in impact makes no sense whatsoever when the most we could have from lockdown or masks is a double digits percentage difference, right, pushing out the curve. And we know that this region is locking down and masking at crazy levels. So that's the first point. Now we'll look again Australia, New Zealand, and the region we talked about, around 30 deaths per million versus nearly 900. And we'll note that New Zealand and Australia are actually just fitting in with their region. So regardless of particular interventions, they're kind of just fitting in with the whole broad region. Now we need to visit seasonality. So this virus, like influenzas and coronaviruses of old, is extraordinarily super seasonal. Now there are some anomalies being pointed out, like South Africa in its summer is seeing a second surge for sure, but anomalies are acceptable once you keep your eye on the big picture. So for Europe and Northeast North America and the traditionally powerfully seasonal regions, it's extremely powerful still with no exception, and that covers billions of people, so that's established. So we look now at Italy, got its kind of seasonal massive surge when the virus triggered, and again we're seeing a winter resurgence now because we didn't get everyone here with immunity and full exposure, so sadly this winter there's a resurgence. But note Peru and Brazil, completely different triggering, right? And this is in line with the work of Dr. Edgar Hope Simpson and his book The Transmission of Influenza, but completely different triggering of the virus. Now, Peru was locked down, Brazil, sloppy lockdown here and there. Peru had mandatory masks, military-grade lockdown. So clearly, again, the lockdown and masks didn't really make a difference, as we've been pointing out. I'd also show that this triggering is very profound. And here's an example from 2018. I think it was New York. It's the US anyway. And you can see that H1N1 triggered in December and peaked in the classic curve. No lockdowns back then, but the classic curve is followed. But note that H3N2, which hit them harder for mortality that year, it triggered generally around March and into April for its peak. And note that H3N2 was certainly around here in swabs. So it wasn't like it just appeared from the moon out here. It was here, but it did not trigger. It waited and it triggered out here. And note that the triggering of H3N2 versus H1N1 that year, there was a 4-month difference. Now, because it's North America, which is like Europe, it's all in the winter kind of period, but a 4-month difference for the virus to decide to trigger. Okay, and 50 years of study have not answered the question why this is. So you can't expect us to answer it. It's a profound phenomenon, mechanism, but they have not worked out why or what the mechs are. So keep that in mind. Now we'll go back to our seasonality graph here, and we'll note that in November 2019, Brazil had SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID in the unfortunate, in human sewage. So it's in human circulation back in November. But look where it triggers. Okay? And we have no real impact out here, and yet it's in circulation. Also, from one study of Italy, they've found in stored blood 14% antibody positive for SARS-CoV-2 in September in Italy. It dropped to 2.8% in January. So again, there was no major impact with this, but it dropped in seropositivity. And then in February, it shot up to 20%. And then, of course, we got the real triggering. So there's a lot of profound mechanisms going on here that no one's talking about, right? We had in Spain as well, November, human sewage and other areas of Europe, and the first deaths in December, January. So all of this was going on, but the real triggering was later. And some of that may relate to dormancy, something I'll cover in a future talk, because Edgar Hope Simpson had it as the basis of his hypothesis for influenza spread and triggering. And people will say, oh, but there's no dormancy in influenza or coronaviruses. Well, there's dormancy in myriad viruses. So we have HIV, we have herpes, many types, dormant for years, chickenpox, shingles, malaria, Epstein-Barr, and so on and on and on. So viruses, as a rule, have enormous capability for dormancy. Interestingly, there's a couple of studies showing evidence of dormancy for the common cold as well, though that would be controversial, and also one influenza A study from children's throats showing viable dormant virus. Right? So this may be a much bigger thing than is appreciated. And it's very hard to prove or show because you need to get deep lung or airway tissue and do very deep analysis to find the virions in the inactive state. So this is for a future talk. But anyway, just grasp the seasonality. So we go back again, Australia, New Zealand, they're in the middle of the pack. And we'll look at Japan. And remember that Japan is in the same broad region and it's had tiny death rates relatively. So we put Sweden here with no lockdowns, no masks, and it's around 30 times higher death rate. But remember that Europe generally, and the UK even worse, had lockdowns and masks to beat the band, and they're worse than Sweden. So there's this enormous difference of 30x or 3,000%. And again, it ain't lockdowns or masks because Europe is locking down harder and masking harder even than these guys over in Japan, South Korea, Singapore. So what is it? Well, I'll just give a couple of examples. One is the extraordinarily high health status of elderly Japanese. And the data for vitamin D, which reflects metabolic health, is dramatically different than European aged. So that's one thing, metabolic health. But the other really fascinating thing is prior immunity and cross immunity and T-cell immunity. And I'm going to show you this study, which is one of its kind. We're very lucky to have it. But this team did what engineers would do when trying to understand this. They tracked a few hundred individuals in 11 regions of Tokyo, which was not locked down, by the way. There was a certain amount of mask wearing, I guess. And as they went through their hump, right, it was back in July, August, here's PCR positivity, so the classic curve. They went through a hump. But here's the antibody positive status of the several hundred people. And as you can see, it rose up during the hump to nearly 50% became antibody positive for SARS-CoV-2. Now, they weren't getting the mortality impacts, and a lot of them were asymptomatic. But the immune system can get T-cell activation and antibody generation, right? It's reacting, but you're not symptomatic and you're not a problem as such. Right? But the reason that they may have had much less impact is because of prior cross immunity to SARS-1 in the region and other coronaviruses. So they would have had an advantage, and their immune system would react a lot faster to SARS-CoV-2, and to not be symptomatic and to get over something quickly and not end up in the ICU, speed of reaction of your immune system is a crucial vector. Okay, if your immune system reacts really fast and starts pumping out antibodies, you'll probably be in fine shape. And if your immune system completely does not recognize and has to get its gear together, you could end up in a very serious state before your immune system is really dealing with the problem. So that's Japan. And it's really key to know that Japan did not stop the spread, even though everyone thinks that. They just didn't get impacted. And that's in common with the broad region that Australia, New Zealand, and all those countries are in. So we'll finish off back with the world. So 900 deaths per million out here, 30 times higher than this region. Okay, and China is the epicenter of where SARS-CoV-2 came from. I don't think anyone will argue with that. But there were flights, of course, going constantly back and forth to this huge region from October, November, when SARS-CoV-2 was out walkabout. But there were also intense numbers of flights down to Australia and New Zealand. They're very linked to China. Okay, so if we look at a timeline, November through to February, we'll see that the virus coming out of China on airplanes and whatever else, all the way through these several months, was unhindered and unrestricted. No one was doing jack up until February across any of these regions to stop that. And New Zealand and Australia only stopped the flights from China in early February. So they were getting all the flights and all the movement of the virus for several months before anything was done. So the question is, in all that period of virus movement, right, how did they end up with a very low apparent burden? Now, one advantage is that New Zealand and Australia had this influx during their summer, at the end of their summer, and it was a very good one. So they would be in a great position to take this influx without any major impact. But you still might expect some T-cell immunity to flare up and maybe a kind of a safe spread to go on. So what's really going on here in Australia and New Zealand during this whole period? And I, for one, would love to get, and if anyone could send it to me, a T-cell immunity study from the blood of people in New Zealand and Australia around February, March 2020. Because that might give very interesting kind of insights into this scenario we're talking about. So, that said, we'll go back to zero COVID strategy for Ireland, right? 28th of January 2021, this is suggested. Okay, now, who would suggest in an area that's in its winter resurgence, right, second cycle of a virus, and already is up close to 1,000 deaths per million, or 0.1%, and by the spring will have largely headed out of this thing, who on earth would compare a country in this region, in that state, to this one we've just described, New Zealand? Who would do that? And I, in my opinion, would say they'd want to be pretty stupid to suggest that, wouldn't they? But there you go. If anyone does know of antibody tests, but preferably T-cell surveys that might have been done in this region back in February, I'd be really interested if you could send them on to me. Thank you.
So I think you have to be completely stupid not to realise that there is a difference between Asiana, Asian countries, and the Western world, in that they did a lot of things, which doesn't include masks because that's just a silly thing to do. But they are still finding cases via the PCR test, which obviously has been proven to be false positives. So I really suspect that all of these cases that they keep on coming up with are following the agenda, which you'll find in every single country doing the same thing, are actually false positives. So they haven't actually got anybody who is ill from the virus. Whatever virus you want to say it is, whether you want to say it's flu virus or whether you want to say it's this coronavirus or SARS-CoV, whatever virus it is, there's a virus We have it every year. It so happens that this year the government have seized on that narrative and pushed it so that we now are living in fear of our lives for a virus that we get every year. People die. Let's face it, in the UK, people under the age of 60, during the main part of the pandemic in 2020, 400 people died. That's it. 400 died of COVID. Alright, forget the others. I don't mean that unkindly, because they all had other health issues. So the many thousands and thousands of people that died, that they keep on banging on about, all died of other things, and COVID was not the main cause. Just because you tested positive for PCR test for this virus, they suddenly put it down on your death certificate that you died of COVID, when in actual fact you probably didn't. And we all know that's true, because they've been putting down people that fell off ladders, got run over by a bus, because they've been doing it within 28 days of a test. And in actual fact, last month they changed that to within 60 days. So if you get run over by a bus, it goes down as COVID. So this is how they managed to scam everybody into fear-mongering, keeping everybody in their houses. And we don't see that in Thailand. You don't see that. You don't see the government making people. I know they did have initially, they did have curfews and things like that, but I think that again was because of the narrative that every country was doing it at the time, including Australia, which is Asiana. Talk about Australia because that one was the worst one for being harsh. Even now, they have 0 infections, but they get 1 case and they lock down again. And lockdowns do not work. There are 29 studies saying they do not work. That is why Thailand avoided the virus in the same way that we had it bad. That's it for today. Have a good day. Bye for now.